After an intense lovemaking session with my wife, Cindy, I felt drained but satisfied. It had been a long, stressful day at work, but I pushed all that aside to focus on her, to focus on us. For the first time in a while, it felt like we were connected again. But just as I was catching my breath, she turned toward me, her face calm but serious. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "Nate," she said, "how about an open marriage?" Her words hit me like a slap across the face. I sat up, heart pounding, unsure if I'd heard her right. Open marriage? Was this some kind of twisted joke? Before I could respond, she kept going. "Let's not pretend like you don't want some fun too. We've been distant lately, and, well, our lovemaking feels like the same old routine. I think it's time we try something new." I stared at her, struggling to process what she just said. This wasn't some offhand comment. She meant it. This wasn't the first time Cindy had complained about our relationship. She frequently mentioned how boring things had become, not just in the bedroom, but in our day-to-day life. Initially, I dismissed her suggestion as a sick joke. How could we raise our daughter in such a chaotic arrangement? But soon, the truth began to unravel. Cindy was already seeing someone else. I still remember how I met Cindy like it happened yesterday. It was an ordinary evening at the mall. I'd just gotten off work, tired and distracted, rushing through the aisles. Then, bam. I turned a corner too quickly and collided with her shopping basket. Groceries scattered everywhere, apples rolling across the floor, a box of cereal toppling over. I knelt down to help, mumbling apologies as I gathered the scattered items. Then I looked up, and there she was. Long brown hair falling over her shoulders, soft eyes sparkling with amusement rather than irritation. She laughed, not the forced, polite kind, but a genuine laugh that made me forget how exhausted I was. I offered to replace anything that might have gotten bruised. She smiled and said, "I think I'll survive." It could have ended there, a simple, forgettable encounter, but something about her made it impossible to just walk away. As she gathered her bags, I insisted on helping her to the entrance. It was dark outside, and I didn't feel right leaving her alone in the parking lot. We waited together at the curb until her cab arrived. Just as she was about to get in, I hesitated, then asked for her number. She paused for a heartbeat, studying me with those curious eyes, then handed me a receipt from her bag with her number scribbled on the back. "Don't lose it," she said with a teasing smile before disappearing into the cab. We started talking, then dating, and before I knew it, she was the center of my world. 1 year later, I got down on one knee and asked her to be my wife. She said yes with tears in her eyes, and in that moment, I thought I'd found my forever. We got married. It was everything I ever wanted: love, partnership, and the promise of forever. We built a life together, filled with laughter, late-night talks, and eventually, our daughter. We had a home, a future, something real. But as the years went by, things shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Cindy changed. The woman who once lit up every room now seemed distant, restless. It started with small complaints, how I worked too much, how our date nights felt routine. Then it escalated. She said I was predictable, boring. I told myself it was just a rough patch. Every marriage has them, right? But as days passed, she kept on with the attitudes. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. After our conversation that night, and after telling her that an open marriage was a silly joke, my wife started keeping late nights, giving flimsy excuses, lies disguised as casual explanations. I wasn't blind. She was cheating on me. The idea of an open marriage wasn't about spicing things up or exploring new experiences. It was her way of dressing up her betrayal, a twisted attempt to make her infidelity acceptable. And no matter how hard I tried to deny it, our forever was already falling apart. I couldn't take it anymore. The lies, the late nights, the disappearing acts. It had to stop. For weeks, I swallowed my pride, hoping, praying she'd come to her senses. But there's only so much a man can take. When she came home that night, nearly dawn, I was done pretending. She didn't expect to see me sitting there, waiting. Her eyes widened for a split second before she masked it with indifference, tossing her purse onto the couch like nothing was wrong. "Where the hell have you been?" I demanded. My voice was sharp, angrier than I intended. But I didn't care anymore. She sighed, exasperated, like I was some annoying parent scolding a rebellious teenager. "Out! I told you I'd be late." I stepped closer, fists clenched at my sides. Late? It's 4 in the morning, Cindy. This isn't coming home late. This is coming home after spending the night somewhere else. Her eyes met mine, cold and defiant. No excuses this time, no apologies, just brutal honesty. So, what if I did? She shot back, arms crossed. Are we really gonna play this game, Nate? Pretending everything's fine? I'm tired of living like this, tired of pretending we're still us. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. No remorse, no guilt, just detachment. Let's stop pretending, Nate, she continued. We're stuck in this cycle. Same house, same routine, same everything. Maybe it's time for something different. I could barely form words. You're talking about an open marriage? Why not? She shrugged like she was suggesting a new restaurant. It works for other couples, it could work for us. We have a daughter, Cindy, I said through gritted teeth. What about her? What kind of example are we setting? Her eyes flashed with irritation. Our daughter will be fine. She has 2 parents who love her. What we do, what I do, has nothing to do with her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was so wrapped up in her own selfish desires that she couldn't or wouldn't see the damage she was causing. Our daughter wasn't just fine. She was at the center of it all, watching, absorbing everything, even if Cindy refused to admit it. Look, Nate, I'm not asking for permission. I'm giving you a choice, an open marriage or a divorce. Those are your options. In that moment, I saw her for who she'd become, someone I didn't recognize. The woman I'd married was gone, replaced by someone driven by selfish desires, someone willing to throw away everything we built. I should have walked away right then, but I didn't. Instead, something inside me snapped. If she wanted an open marriage, fine. I'd give her exactly what she asked for. She thought she'd won, thought she'd get everything she wanted without consequences. But she was dead wrong. If she wanted to play games, she was about to learn what happens when you play against someone who's already lost everything. One evening, after one of her usual late-night hangouts, she came home, probably expecting the same old routine. Me asleep in bed, none the wiser. But not this time. I was waiting. The door creaked open slowly. Cindy stepped inside, barefoot, heels dangling in her hand, her makeup smudged just enough to tell me she'd had a good time wherever she'd been. She didn't even bother looking my way as she tossed her purse on the couch, completely unfazed, like she owned the place. I watched her silently from the armchair, the dim glow of a single lamp casting sharp shadows across the room. Her head snapped up when she noticed me sitting there, unmoving. For the first time in a while, she looked caught off guard. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, fingers interlocked. My voice was low but steady. We'll do it. Her brow furrowed. Do what? The open marriage, I said. You win. She blinked, stunned, processing what I just said. Then, slowly, a smile stretched across her face. Not a relieved smile, but something more. Triumphant. I knew you'd come around, she practically beamed. This will be so good for us. You'll see. I forced a smile back, letting her believe she'd won, but in my mind, I was already 2 steps ahead. I wasn't interested in sharing her, but if she wanted an open marriage, I'd give her one, just not the way she expected. That's when I hired Susan. Susan was everything Cindy used to be, warm, kind, and attentive. She moved into our home as my partner, a carefully constructed illusion. Our deal was simple. She'd help with the house, be there for our daughter, and play the perfect lover whenever Cindy was around. And she played her role perfectly. She helped our daughter with her homework, tucked her into bed, and read her bedtime stories, the kind Cindy hadn't bothered with in months. She cooked warm, homey meals that filled the house with a comforting aroma Cindy hadn't cared to create in a long time. At first, Cindy didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She was too busy chasing her own fantasies. But that changed, fast. One night, she came home late again, expecting the usual cold, silent house. But instead, she walked into the sound of soft laughter drifting from the kitchen. I could see it in her face. The sudden pause, the tightening of her jaw as she stood frozen in the hallway. You're impossible, Susan's voice rang out playfully from the kitchen. And you love it, I replied with just the right amount of warmth. Cindy stepped into view just as Susan and I shared a knowing glance, a moment crafted with precision, just for her. Her eyes darkened. She didn't say a word, just brushed past us, pretending she didn't care. But the way she slammed the bedroom door told me everything I needed to know. We never crossed any real lines. but Cindy didn't know that. Every shared laugh, every lingering touch of the hand, it was all part of the act, and it drove her insane. The real blow came when our daughter started gravitating towards Susan. She'd rush past Cindy without a second glance, wrapping her arms around Susan with the kind of affection Cindy hadn't earned in a long time. It killed her. I could see the guilt twisting in her expression every time she watched them together. But she never said anything. Maybe she was too proud. Maybe she thought she could outlast whatever game she thought I was playing. But I wasn't done. Her so-called partner, the man she'd thrown everything away for, he was next on my list. A few well-placed conversations, a few subtle hints about her, complications, and just like that, his interest evaporated. Turns out, he wasn't as committed to the whole open relationship idea as she thought. Suddenly, her thrilling new world wasn't so exciting anymore. She checked her phone obsessively, growing more and more frustrated as her messages went unanswered. The freedom she'd fought so hard for started to feel a lot like loneliness. She'd walk into the house now, late as ever, but there were no more victorious smirks, no more triumphant gleams in her eye. She'd see the warmth of our home, the life she'd left behind, and realize she was nothing more than a visitor in it. One evening, she sat alone at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched glass of wine, fingers tracing the rim in slow, absent circles. The house around her buzzed with quiet life. Our daughter's laughter echoing down the hall, Susan and I talking softly by the fireplace. She was outside of it all, looking in. And for the first time, she realized what she'd truly lost. Things were getting too easy, too predictable for Cindy, so I had to step it up a notch. One night, when I knew she'd be out, I set the stage. Susan and I had already perfected the art of subtle intimacy, laughing, touching, making her feel the sting of her own choices. But now, it was time for something more. I left the bedroom door just slightly ajar, enough to let the sounds drift into the hallway, but not too much to give it away immediately. The soft creak of the bed, the rustling of sheets. Susan played along flawlessly. She knew exactly how to moan just loud enough to make it sound real, but not so loud that it was obvious. Every gasp, every soft whisper, perfectly timed. We didn't need to do anything more than that. It was enough. As I lay there, pretending to be lost in the moment, I could hear Cindy's footsteps in the hallway. It was late, later than usual. She'd been out longer than she expected. She must have been coming back from another one of her late-night rendezvous. But when she reached the hall outside our room, she stopped. Her footsteps faltered. I could practically hear her breath catch as she lingered by the door, listening. The faint sounds of me and Susan, they were unmistakable. I glanced at Susan, our eyes meeting briefly. We both knew what was happening. I saw Cindy's silhouette, frozen just outside the door, leaning against the wall. The weight of the moment sank in as she stood there, holding her breath, unsure if she should move or stay. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. But in her mind, I knew she was running through everything. Her choices, the lies, the marriage she was slowly losing. And in that silence, I could see the reflection of her own jealousy, her own isolation. She was the outsider now, peeking into a life she had no part in. Finally, she exhaled softly and walked away, her footsteps retreating down the hall, a quiet resignation in her step. I couldn't help but smirk. She was starting to understand, maybe too late, that the world she was trying to build had no place for her anymore. As the weeks passed, it became painfully clear that Cindy's so-called freedom was slipping through her fingers. Her first lover, the one she'd put all her hopes on, was pulling away. His interest had faded. He wasn't answering her calls as eagerly, and the late-night texts were becoming fewer. The way he started to pull back, distancing himself just enough to make her question what was happening. So, like the pattern she always followed, Cindy found someone new. Another partner to fill the void, to make her feel wanted, to prove that she was still desirable, still in control of her own choices. This time, it was someone she thought would be different, someone she could count on. She was wrong. But as much as she tried to reignite that spark with him, something wasn't right. He became distant too, his messages sparse, his excuses even more creative. Something was off. Cindy was too proud to admit it, but deep down, she knew. He wasn't interested anymore. Maybe he'd found someone else, or maybe he'd just grown bored of the game. Either way, she could feel him slipping through her fingers, just like the last one. What she didn't know was that I'd already figured it out. I had eyes and ears everywhere. I tracked him down, paid him off, no questions asked. A little cash, a few well-placed words, and just like that, he started avoiding her too. He didn't answer her calls, didn't show up to their meetings. Every time she tried to reach out, he gave her cold, one-word responses. He was done. The moment Cindy realized her newest flame had fizzled out, I could almost hear the crushing weight of her disappointment. She was back at square one. But the cracks in her world were becoming too big to ignore. I could see the change in her when she came home that night, drunk, eyes red, as if she'd been crying for hours. She didn't even try to put on the usual confident act. She stood in the doorway, watching Susan and I in the kitchen, talking and laughing like we'd known each other for years. It was as if we were a world apart from her, a world she could no longer get back into. The jealousy was palpable. She was trying to hide it, but I could see it in the way her hands clenched into fists by her sides, the way her gaze shifted from Susan to me. The warmth we shared, the laughter, the way I touched her gently on the arm, it was everything she'd lost. The reality hit her like a wave. Out there, she thought she'd find excitement, freedom, something better. But what she saw now, the connection we had, the stability, the family we'd built, it was clear that it wasn't just the marriage that she'd thrown away. It was the very life she had with us, a life she thought she could replace with fleeting moments of pleasure. But that world? It wasn't what she'd thought it would be. The men, the excitement, they didn't care about her. They didn't give her the security or love she wanted. They were just distractions. That night, she didn't say anything to me or Susan. She just stood there in the doorway, lost in her thoughts, staring at the life she'd once had, the life she was now losing. But I knew what was coming. I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was realizing that nothing out there could compare to the family we had, the love she once had. And the more she saw Susan and me together, the more she realized what she'd given up, and for nothing. As the days passed, Cindy's desperation became more and more obvious. She tried everything, tried to turn the tables, tried to manipulate me into believing that somehow the whole arrangement was wrong. One evening, she sat me down, her voice filled with a mix of frustration and a failed attempt at control. "Susan needs to leave," she said, her eyes darting nervously between me and the kitchen counter. This wasn't the agreement. Yes, I have a lover, but I didn't bring him home. I didn't even flinch. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip from my glass, and then I caught her off guard, cutting her off mid-sentence. "There was never an agreement about where anyone met their partners, Cindy," I said, my tone calm but unwavering. "And Susan is here because she's been doing what you've neglected for months, taking care of our daughter, handling things you couldn't be bothered to manage." I could see her face shift, the anger, the frustration, it all melted into something else. Her eyes widened as the truth finally hit her. The reality of what she'd done, of what I'd been doing, was starting to sink in. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. There was no going back. But Cindy wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. She sat there for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter, her thoughts swirling. It was as if she couldn't process what was happening, as if she was trying to find a way to make it all go back to the way it was. I saw the crack in her facade. She was struggling, broken in a way I hadn't seen before. And then, that night, the moment I knew was coming arrived. She came to me in tears, genuine tears, not the kind she'd faked before. Her voice wavered as she spoke, each word laced with regret. "Nate, I want things to go back to how they were," she said, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears. "I want our family back. I want you. Please send Susan away. Just please, let's go back to what we had." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment I saw the woman I once loved. But the reality of what she was asking, what she was expecting, was too much for me to ignore. I shook my head slowly. There was no going back. "No, Cindy," I said firmly, my voice cold. "It's too late. Trust, once broken, can't be mended. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." I could see her face crumble. She wasn't ready to hear it, but she had no other choice. The life she wanted, the life she thought was waiting for her, was slipping away. When Cindy begged me to send Susan away and fix things, I couldn't even bring myself to feel pity for her anymore. She was a woman so far gone. She still couldn't see the magnitude of her actions. But I knew. I knew what had to be done. "Cindy," I said, my voice steady but harsh, "I'm filing for divorce. You've broken everything we built. You've destroyed the trust we had, the family we made." She recoiled, a stunned look crossing her face. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for a way out, as if the words I said hadn't truly sunk in yet. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Then the floodgates opened. "Please, Nate," she sobbed, her voice a mixture of guilt and desperation. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I want to come back. I'll make it work. I'll fix things. Just don't do this. Please." I could see the desperation in her eyes, the panic setting in as she realized how far gone she was. "All the men who left you, that was me. I paid them off, Cindy. I made sure they walked away from you. I wanted you to understand something, to see that men can give you up for anything. You're not as special as you think. The life you thought you could live, with endless excitement and freedom, it's not real. It's a fantasy. They didn't care about you." Her face turned pale. The words I spoke hit her like a sledgehammer. She was shocked, disoriented. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the bitter realization slowly creeping in. "I wanted you to see the truth, Cindy," I continued. "That chasing this idea of freedom was never going to bring you happiness. It was never going to replace what we had. But now, I'm done. I'm done trying to save something you've already destroyed." I stood up, my decision final, my mind made up. She begged me to reconsider, to give her a chance, but I couldn't listen anymore. The very next day, I filed for divorce. That moment, everything fell apart. The woman I had once loved, the woman I'd trusted with my heart and soul, she was gone. In her place stood someone who cared only for her own desires, willing to sacrifice everything for them. The divorce process was swift, and in a couple of weeks, the court granted the divorce and, in their wisdom, ordered Cindy to move out of the house. It was a decision that stung, but it was necessary. I wasn't going to let her continue to tear apart what was left. The judge ruled that I would be the one to supervise Cindy's visits with our daughter, a last attempt at making sure our child wasn't caught in the middle of Cindy's selfishness. She fought it, cried, begged, said she was sorry, again and again. She told me she regretted everything, that she'd change. But by then it was too late. There was no changing it, no going back to what was lost. I let her keep some money, enough to get by, but there was no other safety net. She had to face the consequences of her actions. I had nothing more to give her. When she left the house that day, I could see the regret in her eyes. The once proud woman, now broken and desperate, carrying with her the weight of her decisions. But even then, I knew there was no turning back. I was done, and in my heart, I knew I'd made the right choice. After the divorce, Susan packed her things, telling me her job was done. I watched her, and for a moment I thought she might walk out the door, but I couldn't let her go. She had become more than just the woman I hired to make Cindy jealous. She had become family. She had been there for me, for my daughter, in ways I never thought possible. I saw how she cared for us, how she was always there when I needed her, even when I couldn't admit I did. It wasn't a game anymore. It was real. As she started to leave, I realized I couldn't lose her. She wasn't just a part of the plan. She was the future I hadn't even known I was looking for. So I asked her to stay. I loved her, and I needed her to be a part of our lives.